I think this is a perfect time to be building with or building for these tools because the components out there are just so mature. Like now for payments, you don't want the coding agent to, build Stripe from scratch. Because I know there's a lot of people building Stripe clones, Airbnb clones, but in reality, you would just ask the coding agent to actually add Stripe as a component or add Clerk as a component for Authenticate.
Justine, Yoko, welcome to the show. What is vibe coding and why has it at least seemingly taken the internet by storm?
So my understanding of vibe coding is that you give a coding agent a set of instructions and you just let it go. And the only thing you need to do is to provide natural language instructions. Like, I like this, I don't like this, this vibes well with me, this doesn't. So that's how vibe coding is, I think.
Yeah, and I think we've seen it used by both technical and non-technical people, interestingly. Like some really technical people have been tweeting about how instead of like coding something from scratch, they're just like going to an LLM and saying, this is what I want to make, and then iterating on it. And then maybe they're kind of exporting the code to wherever they like to edit it and making their own edits and then deploying it. And then there's also a lot of completely non-technical people who are like purely just going on vibes, who have never been able to make anything before, who are like entirely reliant on an LLM to write code for them, which is very cool.
Yeah, and to your point, it's not just the non-technical who are doing this and then the technical are kind of using this paternalistic term. The term actually comes from Andrej Karpathy, right? Who is like extremely technical, like is behind the LLMs that are actually helping people vibe code. Their entire Reddit community is behind this. And on the back of that, there are these companies that are being built that help people vibe code. So who's actually participating in this trend? What are the companies that are being used? And how would you also kind of like frame them in terms of like, are there different categories within this trend?
Yeah, so we've seen different companies serve different types of users. So I think there are some more sort of like IDE-based companies like Cursor that are targeting developers and just making it a lot easier for them to code by giving an agent a prompt and then it writes code or edits code for you. And then we've also seen a new emergence, both for non-technical and also being used by technical users, of these like text-to-web app or text-to-website companies that are in the browser. And like you literally go, it's a web app, you type it in, you say, hey, I want an app to track if my dog has been fed, or I want a website for my small local business where people can find information and contact me. And then you sort of get this interface where usually they all look pretty similar. On the left side, you prompt it, and then on the right side, it kind of shows you what it's generating, what the interface looks like, and then you can say, no, I want this button to do this, or no, I want the design to do that. So we've seen a ton of companies emerge in this category. I think the biggest ones we've seen thus far are probably like the Replit agent, Lovable, Bolt, and VZero from Vercel. But we're seeing more products emerge here every day.
Yeah, definitely seeing a divergence of different persona using different tools and reaching for different tools. So for example, like as an engineer, maybe my first instinct is like, IDE is where I live. So I want to do everything in my IDE, or Vim back in the days, now it's Cursor. Yeah. But for someone who may just want to, build a marketing landing page, they may reach for, Bolt, Lovable, and VZero because they generate just very visually appealing assets. Just for different use cases and what, people are used to from the very get-go.
Yeah. And give me a sense of scale here, right? Because I think maybe Cursor is becoming more of a household name. A lot of people refer to it as one of the fastest growing companies over the last 2 years. But what about some of these others? Like, are people really using these tools at scale, or are we really in the early innings?
Yeah, it's a great question. Not every company has released their metrics. I think Bolt and Lovable both have either tweeted about it or talked about it on podcasts and are saying things like getting to 20 million in ARR in 2 months or 10 million in ARR in 2 months, which is an insanely fast ramp. And so I think to us that indicates like there's a ton of latent demand for people who want to use these tools or want to code or make something for the first time and are finding a ton of value in being able to do it like in a more accessible way. Obviously, there's also a ton of demand from developers to code more easily because Cursor is growing incredibly fast as well.
I think it's actually just very qualitatively, like metrics aside, I think it's solving a very real problem. Like my cousin who wants to say build his personal app for tracking like his how often his flowers are watered.
Yeah.
Like before, consumers like this, they couldn't have made an app for themselves. They have to, find an app that works for them. But now, like I think the beauty is that they can create some of this themselves, and they can run it on their local machine forever and never deploy it for anyone else. So it's like there's so much personalization needs. This is solving.
Totally. Yeah, software for one. I feel like I'm hearing that more and more where it's like, I have a friend who wrote a book and he's like, I've always wanted my own personal page to show my book sales. And like, I've tried to learn to code. It just never happened. So tell me more about that, because it does seem like, okay, it seems like you could maybe create a static web page, maybe something like a tracker, some of these more early stage like websites, maybe not full blown apps. Am I getting that sense, or am I wrong about like where these tools are and where they end perhaps in what you can build?
Yeah, I think the difference with like the vibe coding products versus products we'd seen before to help non-technical people generate websites like a Squarespace or a Wix is that they're actually writing code. So they can actually like do more kind of interactive and dynamic things. Like one example is like even me with Lovable made a web app where you input a book that you liked growing up. It does a call to the OpenAI API, gets a response about like 3 books you might like now based on the book you liked growing up. Then you can save the book in a database that I like prompted within Lovable. And then you can even log in with your Gmail account, which like a Google authentication API, if you want to like save books and then rate them. And so that sort of thing I think is beyond, like far beyond just like a basic static website. It's like truly a dynamic web app. That was a little bit harder than just like pure text prompts. It required me going and, I mean, the LLM would explain it to me. I would say like, hey, I want to add authentication. And it would be like, okay, here's the 5 steps, but you do have to click out to this external link. And you do have to be able to like copy in these codes and keys into one places or another. But someone like me who's non-technical was able to do it. And so I think our belief is it's just going to keep getting easier.
Yeah. The components, I think this is a perfect time to be building with or building for these tools, because the components out there are just so mature. Like now for payments, you don't want the coding agent to, build Stripe from scratch. Because I know there's a lot of people building Stripe clones, Airbnb clones, but in reality, you would just ask the coding agent to actually add Stripe as a component or add Clerk as a component for Authenticate.
Yeah. I mean, to that point, these tools are pretty magical, right? You can build way more than what especially non-technical person could have built in the past. Can we just quickly revisit that idea of the why now? Like, why are these tools so good? Are we a little surprised even that these LLMs are so good with code? Because that, to me, would have not been intuitive coming in. And maybe just tell us a little bit more about like the building blocks that led us to having these tools in the first place.
Yeah, so I guess on the very lowest level of layer, which is the foundational models, all of these tools are powered by very good coding models out there. So why are the models good? One, obviously, is like transformer architecture and everything. But 2, I think it's the plethora of the data distribution is there on the internet. Mm-hmm. Most of the apps nowadays are JavaScript apps. Like if you go on Stack Overflow before AI age, most of the questions people ask are like, why can this Node.js app work? And then you get answers for that. And now there's a lot more like frameworks that's very well defined, like Next.js, React, right? So you really travel up the abstraction in coding. So as a result, when you train a coding model with the data, there's just way more examples of web frameworks, web data. So as a result, it's very good at building those apps. Another reason I actually think is web-based developed environment now is very mature. So before you may need like a front end, which is like HTML, JavaScript, and back end like Rust, or maybe back in this C#.NET or something. But nowadays, like the full stack apps are all JavaScript. Like the most of the apps we see that are being generated are all JavaScript and TypeScript based. So it's in itself a very contained runtime. The agents can automatically verify, like, did I do a good job generating this? Or, is this like actually correct? Can it run in the browser? So all of that, I think the confluence of that made generating code much easier.
Totally, yeah. And I think we're seeing on the foundation model layer, just to add, the companies are really focusing on code as a benchmark. Like we see when OpenAI or Anthropic or anyone puts out a new model, they're generally measuring performance on code-related tasks or benchmarks. And the great thing for people like me then who can't code myself is like amazing. Like the LLMs are now learning to code much faster than I could. And I can provide some direction or guidance as it's trying to debug itself. But it's able to do things that would take me like years to learn.
For sure. And maybe we can answer the question as well in terms of how these work, right? Some people might think that this is just like an API call to a foundational model. Is it that, or is there more built on top? And then adding on to that, how do these different companies add value, right, past the integration with the foundational model? And how do they differentiate, across the competition?
These are actually very sophisticated systems when we, lift the covers and look into how they could be implemented. So the consumer interface is always like Justine mentioned, there's a generation of the code, there's a preview, there's a prompt window. But then when you kind of lift the cover, what it had to do is that it has to have a execution environment for the agent to actually work in. Mm-hmm. So it needs to ping the foundational model like, hey, my user have this prompt, like give me these examples of the code. And then you have to, the agent will have to tell the foundational model like, generate the code only to this, these set of standards. Mm-hmm. And then once that happens, it runs this code, in the execution environment, which is mostly a browser nowadays. It's either something called web container, which is like a very cool technology that leverages your own, laptop as a compute and then, spin it up like locally, or it's, running on a server somewhere. So it produces that preview for the user. And then kind of like what we discussed on the component side, like a lot of apps can't be built without a database. So you just have to persist the data somewhere that's either in memory in a browser, or it's, more persistent in the actual database like Supabase of the world.
Great. The real question is how well do these work, right? Where would you say, again, like the tools perform well, maybe perform perfectly, all the way to the end of like things are really breaking down, maybe we're not quite there yet?
Yeah, it's so funny because to someone like me, it often feels totally magic that you can prompt and like get a working web app. And then sometimes it's like the most frustrating thing ever because it gets stuck in some bug or loop that it is seemingly not able to fix, or I'm having to tell it like think step by step and figure it out. I think Yoko can speak more specifically to like where they go wrong. But I think one of the problems is just like as these apps get bigger and bigger and more complex, they lose some of the context of like what they've already generated and the environment in which they're operating. And like you might ask for one design change. This has happened to me many times with these tools. You ask for one design change and then it generates that new element. But then somehow something in the new element it generated breaks like 10 previous things it did before. And so suddenly like the authentication doesn't work because you like added an image to the top of the page. And then you have to tell it like, hey, now this other thing is not working. Can you go back and fix it? And the other thing that like sometimes doesn't work about them that is really interesting is the LLMs are always convinced that they can fix something.
They're very optimistic.
They're extremely optimistic, which is sometimes great, but it's sometimes so frustrating when you're on the 40th try of like, you told like, we need to have a different approach. Like this button is still not doing what you said it was going to do. And it's like still just as cheery as it was time two. And it's like, we're going to do this. And you're like, I need to turn it over to a professional at this point. So I think like it depends on sort of the complexity of what you want to build. They can do some things, especially simple things where a code base isn't getting too big, really well and really reliably. But they're definitely not perfect.
Yeah, this is like a very timely podcast just because Cloud just released their latest coding model. And then all over Twitter, people are like, oh, here's a one-shot prompt on creating this, app. Obviously, there's a lot of advancement in the coding capabilities. But at the same time, I think on the infra layer, softwares are always very stateful. So the question is, where do you keep this data and how do you reconcile this data? Where is your auth? Where's your database? Where's your caching? Where's your core logic? I think for that part, it's still a very complex problem that it hasn't done a good job in, reducing the problem space just yet. But I'm actually very hopeful in that it's a verification problem at the very bottom. In that before we always as engineers we commit code and you're like, this is a SHA linked to this list of changes. Now I find myself just keep prompting. And then when it rewrites the whole app for the next prompt, I don't even care about what's the previous version as long as it works. So I actually think the next step for a lot of these tools is adding, how to verify it still works. Is it adding tests? Is it adding something else? There's a lot to be, desired today, but I have high hopes that it's going to get there pretty soon.
Yeah. It seems like a solvable problem for sure. Let's talk about what people are building. I mean, you've mentioned a few examples here, but I'd love to have you both, since you've seen so many projects, kind of talk about the depth and breadth of all the projects that people are creating.
Yeah, I think it varies. There's an extremely long tail of things that people are building, which is fascinating because you can truly build an app for one person yourself, which you could never do before.
I love that, app for one.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's such a good catchphrase. One of these companies should use that.
Yeah.
And so on the consumer side, that's everything from Yoko's cousin's app to track if a plant was fed to
I need that, by the way.
Yeah.
So app for two.
I need it for my dog. So slightly different. To we've seen a dad generating a bedtime story for his kid that always, has his kid's name and interests and things like that. And then it'll read aloud a different story every night. So consumer use cases, just anything you can imagine wanting to build, you can create. We're also starting to see more usage on the kind of moving up into the enterprise part of the spectrum. So small business agencies, there's all of these people who or consultants or could be hired to make a website or a web app for your local business or any sort of kind of professional service provider. And those folks used to use a Squarespace or Wix or something like that. And many of them are now experimenting with Replit or Bolt or Lovable because they can build, they can make projects so much quicker than they could before, which is very cool, which allows them to take on more work, take on smaller projects that might not have made economic sense before. Oh. And then I'll let Yoko talk about what true engineers more in the enterprise are experimenting with.
Yeah, so I think true engineers actually reach for a slightly different tool. True engineers, they would probably start from Cursor, but then for a simple landing page stuff, I think Lovable and Bolt and VZero of the world, they're all just very visually appealing. And then the UI is very different because they can render it. Whereas in Cursor, you kind of render it as a developer. You're responsible for that. But to Justine's point, I think there's something we heard that's so interesting in that a lot of the marketing agencies or just agencies in general, before, Bolt, Lovable, and, VZero of the world, they wouldn't want to take on $1,000, $2,000 projects. Yeah. Nowadays, they can because they can churn out these projects so fast that it is still of very good quality. So what we're seeing is definitely the sum of the long tails is bigger than the head. So that's why people are actually migrating from Squarespace, Wix of the world to this, software for one business.
Yeah, I think that's great. How do you see these products evolving, right? Because today they do seem quite similar. I think you even called out maybe one differentiator, which is, okay, maybe certain products will be more focused on design. You also talked about how maybe certain features aren't quite there yet. Where does this go in terms of how you see maybe the market segmenting or what kinds of new features you see these companies adding?
Yeah, I think today what we've seen is most of these products are trying to be everything to everyone. So it's just a text prompt box and anyone from an everyday consumer to an engineer, they're come one, come all, you can all build something here. And they have very similar interfaces. I think we'd expect to see sort of more segmentation in the features they build and the customer base they focus on, based on a variety of things. You could imagine segmenting by technical sophistication of the end user. So if for an everyday consumer like me, I probably, if I'm just making a simple website or something cool to show my friends, I might even want to make it on my app, with the new Replit app with the AI agent that does it super easily. And the experience of prompting and the level of code it shows me and the level of sophistication will be very different, or probably should be very different, than a product that's like built for engineers who are like prototyping something to like show to their team during stand-up. And then I think sort of beyond the technical and non-technical user segmentation, there's also probably segmentation in terms of like the level of control you expose on various parts of like the website or the web app. Like we've talked a lot about design, how basically most of these tools today, you like prompt that you say like, hey, I want a website or web app with this vibe. And then you can say like slightly different color or move this button. And for a real designer, it's like so frustrating to have to prompt via text.
Yeah.
So we're expecting to see more people add Figma-esque features where you can have like true fine-grained control over design.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting because a lot of people like to talk about like we should empower everyone to learn to code. Like, like now maybe my mom can use the tool to learn to build her own website with code. But I actually don't agree with the view in that as an engineer myself who have, worked in the industry for a long time, I don't think most of the people should learn to code with how good AI is nowadays. I don't think code is the right abstraction for majority of the world. And there's just a lot of latent demand there on what's the right knobs for the actual audience out there to build, software from. Is it natural language? Is it drag and drop? Is it like something like, Figma-like? So the question becomes like, what should we ship for a majority of the world to be able to build software, for one? So it's also interesting because like when we talk to a lot of, more consumer prosumers who, didn't kind of come from a coding background, they actually have no desire to learn to code. Their goal is to ship what they want to ship, coding or not. Right. And then before, it's more static, no code tools like Squarespace, of the world. Nowadays, you have more like fine-grained control on what you want the software to do. So I actually think the next step in a lot of where this is going is like finding what are the things that someone can, do without code, but not as rigid as the previous generation of code.
I think that's such a good point in terms of the like level of abstraction, because even if you take natural language like English, there are different levels that people interface with that, right? Some people can speak in English, but not read or write in English, right? Some people may not recognize specific letters that people write, but again, they understand a specific message that's being delivered or created within that language. Let's talk about pricing, because I actually, I think these different products are so underpriced given the products that people are able to create in terms of, they literally could not create something in the past, and now they can create something of immense value in their life. So tell me about how companies are currently pricing, and then how you think about the comparisons, right? Like, should we be comparing it to the Wixes and the Squarespaces? Is this a completely new market and where a new pricing model needs to emerge? Tell me about how you think about that.
Yeah, the pricing is a really interesting one. I think most of the companies in this space are doing some variation of usage-based pricing. So you'll get some amount of tokens for free, and then they'll press you to convert to a monthly subscription where you get a certain amount of tokens. They have different kind of tiers based on the number of tokens you need. You could sometimes buy more if you need them. But the interesting thing about that model is like, most people, even like technical people, are not thinking about the cost of generating a website or web app in terms of how many tokens they need. Like, most of us have no idea. We're like, I'm like, I don't know, is it going to cost 100, 5,000, 50,000? Like, I don't know. And some of it depends on like the performance of the LLM. Like, if I have to go back and forth with the app a ton, that's going to spend a ton of tokens. Whereas if it gets it right the first time, it's not going to spend a ton of tokens. And so I think like we would love to see more clarity around the pricing models, like making it easier for people to understand upfront, like how much is it going to cost both to build this original website or web app, but then also to maintain it on an ongoing basis. I think the dream for like many products in this space is some sort of value-based pricing, which better aligns like kind of your incentives with the user of like, hey, if someone is creating like an e-commerce store where they're doing like tens of millions in annual revenue and they've created it through your product, like they're probably willing to pay you several $100,000 a year to like keep it up, keep it looking good, like maintain it, that sort of thing. Whereas someone who's just making their personal web page is definitely not going to be paying you hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to do that.
Yeah.
I think there are two ways we traditionally look at pricing. Like this is not a hard and fast rule, but just general trend we have seen. Is the product being used by a machine, or is a script, or is the product being used by a human? There's only so many requests a human can make, even though we keep prompting the app. And there's a lot of tokens.
Yep.
And then usually if it's used by a machine, it's a consumption-based pricing, right? So we see this a lot in the infrastructure players, like either databases or like API products. And then for things that humans use, say maybe Canva, Figma of the world, maybe that's like a per seat per month kind of pricing. Mm-hmm. I totally agree with Justine. I don't think tokens is just the right measurement in the long run. And then I actually do think that the value these tools kind of bring to individual users and enterprises are dramatically different. Mm-hmm. And then for the individual users, maybe it's more like a productivity gain, like is it how much money am I willing to pay per month to get to, where I couldn't have before. And then for enterprises, I actually think it's more packaging question instead of outside of pricing. Like what other team collaboration features I can factor in so that I can pay, more per seat.
Interesting. Speaking of incumbents, do these products survive, right? If you take some of the newer companies that you mentioned that are doing extremely well, getting to millions in ARR very quickly, is it just a matter of time before large companies, let's say like a Google or, maybe a better example would be something like a Figma, right? Which is already has the connective tissue to designers, for example. Is it just a matter of time before they start integrating these features and basically blow these new startups out of the water? Or how do you think about, if there's really defensibility there?
We're in the business of, investing in a lot of, up and coming companies. And then we also think, Figma is a portfolio company and they're doing amazing things in the AI front. So I will actually, definitely count Figma as, one of the trendsetters in the space, especially for design and engineering. There are many ways to tackle the problem, but I think compared to, Google of the world, which if you have used Google Docs or, Excel before, there's always an argument on why didn't they build an AI native Excel like a year ago? Or why didn't they, have a good way to incorporate AI into the writing experience just yet? You ship your org chart. And then as a fact, I actually know that, at Google, you have different orgs shipping for AI and not AI. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's a way to ship AI native products. So I'm obviously we're very optimistic about up and coming startups kind of taking on the incumbent for this very reason.
Yeah. And I think those are great points. And also the good thing about this space is you're creating new markets and it's truly becoming massive. It's kind of similar, honestly, to what we've seen AI do for content generation across all of modalities. Like in some way you can think of I don't know if it's code or website or web app, it's like another modality. AI image generation didn't replace photography and it didn't replace artists. It just allowed people like me who were never creating images or art before to create it. And so I think we'll see something similar in this space where there will be products like Figma that have immense user base, really great products who will be able to approach this problem from hey, we know what our users need and we can gain an advantage from the existing platform we've built by adding features that allow people to go from design to web app or something like that super easily. But then there'll be a huge market of users who like me who are not in Figma every day and don't start in Figma and who are going to start in another sort of product. And so I think that's what's super exciting is it's not like we have this really small constrained pie that everyone is fighting over. It's the pie is getting bigger and bigger every day, especially as these models get better and better because more people can do things and more use cases are being discovered, which is part of what's so exciting about this space.
Totally. I think that is really the most important point, right? Which is just the number of people that can participate here is so unprecedented. Before vibe coding or really just AI code in general, what was it less than 1% of the world knew how to code and therefore could create things with code. And so now, even to your point, Yoko, maybe those people don't need to learn to code, but now they have this resource that they can build with. So maybe ending there, is there any like high level takeaways or things that you want to share in terms of what you're excited about in these next steps, looking ahead, whether it's the specific tools we have now or new tools that you see on the horizon that should be built? What do you think in terms of what's coming?
Even on the developer side, I'm excited to see a new set of tools here. Like instead of like the traditional tools like Git, you should have something else out there that's more AI native. There's a new way of creating software, even for people who can code. And then it's hard to put my fingers on where exactly it will evolve, but I know it will be very dramatically different. Maybe 2 years ago, it was hard to see what would it look like for something like Cursor to come out, right? Now we just use it every day and we're so used to it. Yeah. I actually think it will happen to, most of the developer productivity tools out there.
Yeah, I think from a consumer perspective, two things I'm super excited about. One is the problem of like, how do you integrate other services that you need to make like a truly working web app? Like I would love to not have to go somewhere else to create a database and then go back to a Bolt or Lovable or a Replit or a VZero. I would love to like not have to go to Stripe separately or authentication separately. Like as much as all of that stuff can be packaged in just like one click, it does it for you. I think that will massively explode the consumer usage and small business usage as well. Like honestly, not even consumer, just like non-technical people. And then the second thing I'm really excited about is like, what are the different ways that we can enable prompting here? Like thus far, prompting and creation has been very text-driven, which is great because like if you can speak English, you can make something, which is incredible. But I think especially for more like aesthetically oriented people or just everyday consumers thinking about it, it's like, wouldn't it be cool if I could like upload a screenshot of my Instagram page, or if I could upload my like Spotify listening history, or like my 5 favorite movies and be like, this is my vibe, like truly like
vibe coding.
Exactly, truly. Or like, here's screenshots of like 6 websites that I love. Yeah. Can you make something similar? Yeah. I think that sort of thing will be super interesting and exciting. And especially young people, I think, are going to love like the whole Gen Z and even Gen Alpha younger populations love that sort of thing.
Wait till they realize code can animate things on a web page and like crazy things that they'll start creating with that.
I think we're going to have a return to the like 90s vintage aesthetic for a bit, where you have like the giant mouse that like leaves like a trail across the screen, or like those sort of like fun things that people don't really do anymore.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's one of my personal predictions.
I love that. That's almost like mood board to apps instead of prompt to apps.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
I think also bi-directional. Like I was telling you both, my husband started vibe coding, and he was telling me the things he was doing while he was prompting, and I was like, I would have never thought to ask the AI for design examples. He was like, show me 5 examples of the way that I could visualize this. And I was like, I did not think that was possible, but of course it is, right? And so there's also an element of like knowing how to prompt, but also I think a bi-directional nature where maybe the AI becomes more vocal about like, hey, have you considered this? Instead of it just being like, hey, build this, and then the AI goes and does it.
Yeah, I guess more to the point of software for what I just really love, like this, like this tagline you kind of came up with. Recently, this may be worth a whole different topic, a whole different podcast episode, is that we're seeing a lot more of the developers building MCPs, like Model Context Protocol server. So the way,
just quickly share what that is for folks who aren't
so the way MCP works is that you could build something that extend the capability of a coding agent. So on Cursor, I can build, say, a MCP server to teach agent how to send email. Now I can highlight something and then send emails there. I think it will be the next generation API. I don't know if it's MCP or a different protocol. But these platforms are very quickly becoming very extensible, whether that's from components like Clerk Supabase or from MCP actions that agents can call as tools. Very excited for the next phase of that as more and more people build the plugins here.
Love that. Great. Well, I am so excited to jump from this recording and go vibe code.
Oh, yeah. Amazing.